Imagine this. A condemned man on death row makes one final request. He begs the Virgin Mary to appear before him. What happened next silenced an entire room, leaving even hardened guards speechless. This is not just a story, it's an unforgettable mystery you won't want to miss. So before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Let's begin. The request reached the warden's desk, scrawled in a patient priest's hand, and by the time it filtered down the corridor to cell B17, it had been chewed by bureaucracy and spat back out with a stamp that read, "Accommodated within reason." Within reason meant no candles, no crowd, no incense. It meant a chaplain whose collar was loose with worry, a guard who'd seen enough dying to hate any sentence longer than a minute, and a clock that kept perfect time in a prison where nothing else did. It meant a man on death row named Rafael Ortiz. Tattoos faded from 1,000 laundry washes, knuckles scarred like geography, asking for one last thing before the state took back his breath. Let me see the Virgin Mary. Let her come here to me. I'm not asking the world to move. I'm asking to see what moves the world. When he said it, his voice didn't crack. He stared through the slot, as if the corridor itself were a test, and he'd studied all night. The guard snorted something about theatrics, but the chaplain didn't. He held the bars and said quietly, "If she comes, it won't be for any of us to approve." The prison was a slab of poured certainty on a stretch of earth that remembered when it was farm, then refinery, then forgotten. Storms rolled across it the way stories did, quick, loud, gone. That afternoon, cloud shoulders piled up like a jury, deliberating doom. Cameras that usually blinked green settled into a steady red, as if they'd found their conviction. Somewhere deep in the admin block, a generator coughed, despite having no reason to. "Coincidence," the warden said, because that word is a good leash for complications. He'd served 28 years with a philosophy he could hold in his fist. Doors open, doors close, paperwork rules, the dead don't write grievances. He didn't resent Raphael's request. He resented any request that risked changing the script. Scripts keep a place like this from becoming a mouth that eats itself. The chaplain, Father Luis, rolled a rosary in his palm as if checking each bead for cracks. If faith is real, he told the warden, it can survive a checklist. The warden didn't answer. He signed the form that allowed a small icon to be brought to the observation room at 11 p.m., 1 hour before the sentence, and he underlined a note to deny witnesses beyond essential personnel. Within reason. Raphael's case had been a long, public bruise. The murdered man, an assistant district attorney named Valencia, had been found with his skull opened in a parking lot winter, one glove missing, and a phone smashed into a kind of resignation. The city had demanded a villain with edges they could see. Raphael, a one-time runner for a people who called themselves a family until they weren't, had all the edges. A witness said she saw him fleeing. A camera with an ugly angle suggested the same. The prosecutors glued those pieces together with a story everyone knew how to read. On paper it fit. In the dark it chafed. Raphael had insisted from the first hour it wasn't him, not that night, not that way. He had a tell when he lied. His tongue pressed his molar like it was trying to push a door open from the wrong side. On this, no tell. He took the years, took the appeals, took the isolation like a man swallowing glass to prove to someone something about pain. He had asked for nothing except a Bible without commentary and the names of the men who signed off on his execution. He'd memorized those names, practiced forgiving them until the syllables no longer cut his mouth. "I'll forgive," he said to Father Luis the week before, "but I want to know who's watching me forgive." The icon arrived wrapped in a towel that once had lived in a convent, that once had smelled like bleach and bread. It was small, old, the paint a language of cracks and gold. Our Lady looked like every mother who had learned to comfort without promising anything she couldn't keep. The guard carried it as if it could explode into flame or politics. The observation room was neither holy nor profane. It was functional. A table, a chair, a pane of thick glass on the wall opposite where, in an hour, the world would be forced to demonstrate what it meant by justice. At 10:54 p.m., the Thunder practiced its lines. The warden checked his watch and said, "You have 5 minutes." Father Luis set the icon on the table and stepped back. "You asked to see her," he told Raphael, but I can't order heaven to appear. I can only open the door and stand out of the way." Raphael nodded, a motion that looked like a man lowering a weapon. What happened next would be argued in living rooms and legislatures and back pews for years by people who were sure they'd know a miracle if it licked their hand. The fluorescent bulbs buzzed, then dimmed, as if someone had said hush. The air lost something, heat maybe, or argument. A smell like rain and old wood moved across the room, and for a heartbeat, the icon seemed to hold more light than it reflected. The guard, who didn't do religion, touched his throat. The warden, who didn't do nervous, steadied himself on the doorframe. Father Luis felt the old familiar terror that accompanies the possibility that you've asked for something real. Raphael stared not at the icon, but to the left of it, as if listening to someone enter the room from a door that wasn't there. He took a breath that had no tremor in it and said, to nobody the rest of them could see, "It took you long enough." Then he laughed once, small and hungry, like a man learning he could still be surprised. Afterward, the reports would write it down in careful negatives. No unauthorized person entered. No light source was introduced. No foreign substance was detected. No hymn was sung. No staff member admits to emotional compromise. But in the room, the temperature pinched and then loosened, and the kind of quiet that makes confession possible settled. Raphael's eyes watered, not with pain. He spoke low. "You look like my mother when she told me to stop stealing mangoes and bring my hands where she could see them." He paused, listening. "No, I don't want anything from me. I want one truth. Just one, clean enough to drink." He closed his eyes, then opened them again with a jolt, as if someone had placed a cold spoon against the back of his neck. "You're serious?" he whispered. "Tonight?" Father Luis's mouth formed. "Tonight what?" But he didn't speak. The warden started to say time, but the prison beat him to it. A siren trilled once and died, embarrassed. Every camera blinked, then froze. The red lights went green. The green went nothing. Somewhere deep, a lock slid open and didn't slide back. The control room yelled into radios that hissed back like snakes. On the west wall of the observation room, a hairline crack traced itself down the paint and stopped with the restraint of a saboteur who understands aesthetics. The guard drew the shape of the sign of the cross with the clumsiness of a man copying from memory a language he never learned. "Stay put," the warden ordered the air, and then, "Ortiz, step away from—" He didn't finish. Raphael was already kneeling, not in surrender, but in the way a fighter ties his shoes before entering a ring. "Listen to me," Raphael said. Eyes, bright sharp, not at any of them, but to the presence that had rearranged the room without rearranging it. "If it's what you want, I'll do it." He looked toward the glass that separated this clean waiting from the dirt of the next hour. "But I need proof nobody can argue with." He smiled at the absurdity. "You know how we are." The thunder answered by carefully not answering at all. Father Luis opened his mouth to ask, "Please don't make this about spectacle." But he closed it because he knew better than to tell a storm how to rain. On the far side of the glass, 2 nurses entering the chamber tripped forward suddenly, hands flying to their ears. The speakers above them choked on static and then delivered a sound that had no place in that room. The thin, pure thread of a child's voice singing a lullaby older than prisons. Spanish, then Nahuatl, then something that wasn't either but knew them both. The nurses looked at each other with the shock of people who recognize a room when it remembers what it was supposed to be. The guard dropped his walkie. The warden's hand hovered uselessly near the panic button that wasn't built for metaphysics. "Stop this," he whispered to the chaplain, as if priests carry off switches in their sleeves. Father Luis shook his head. "I didn't start it." The lullaby ended on a note that made the lights steady as soldiers at inspection. In the split second of that quiet, the door to the observation room, the one only the warden could open with a key that wasn't on any ring, clicked. It swung inward as if held by a polite hotel bellman. Standing in the doorway was a woman in blue. She wore no veil, no halo, no theatrical softness. Her hands were bare. Her face was not the face on the icon, not exactly. It was the kind of face you see on a bus at 6:10 in the morning when you are too tired to pretend you don't need help. She looked at Raphael like his name belonged to her. The warden did not move. He could not remember the last time his mouth had been this dry. The guard stepped backward so quickly he almost sat down. Father Luis fell to one knee, because certain lessons do not leave the bones. "Stand up," the woman said to Raphael, in a voice with no patience for drama. He did. She stepped close enough that he could have counted pause, if that had been the point. "You asked for proof," she said. He nodded, eyes burning to hold on. "Here it is. The truth takes longer than a life, but it gets where it's going. Tonight you will see it walk." She turned, as if looking at the glass could look through it, and her eyes were too old and too new. The warden felt the peculiar sensation of being inventoried, and not found lacking so much as unfinished. "You," she said to him without invitation, "have paperwork that will want to be burned when you sleep. Don't keep it, it was not a threat. It was a direction, like put on your coat, it's cold. The door closed with no one touching it." The woman was gone. The icon on the table looked smaller because the room had grown. The guard said something like Jesus, Mary, Joseph in a single exhale that made all three names roommates. The warden stepped forward on legs that could remember ladders and wet roofs and the year his father died. "No one speaks of this," he said, failing to make it a rule. "And we proceed." He looked at Raphael as if the man were a problem he might yet solve. "You've had your request." He couldn't make himself say miracle. It would have meant admitting his vocabulary had always been missing a tool he suddenly needed. They led Raphael into the chamber. The witnesses were few. The DA's widow had declined to attend, not out of mercy, but out of mercy's opposite. She wanted the state to do its work without asking her to clap. The curtain was not drawn. There was no audience to perform for. Father Luis stood near, murmuring a prayer that held the shape of hope, without daring to name it. The nurse checked the line twice, then a third time. Not because she doubted her training, but because something in her kept whispering, "Something is off, that isn't mechanical." She made sure no one could accuse her hands of anything but competence. The warden stood at the pane, watching the choreography he could perform in sleep. He looked not at Raphael but at the clock. Remembered the woman's words, "Keep it." He did not know yet what would ask to be burned. Only later would the switch matter. What mattered first was the door in the anteroom opening again. This time with the frantic clatter of a man who ran faster than he knew how. He wore a suit that had never learned to be his, and he carried a folder hugged to his chest like contraband scripture. "Stop!" he shouted at a room that wasn't built to listen. "Stop! Stop! Stop!" The guard grabbed him. The man kept speaking, each word striking the glass as if hoping to bruise it awake. "I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Marco Ruiz," he gasped. The warden took one look and knew he wasn't lying. Lawyers lie in sentences. Truth runs out of their mouths with their breath. "You can't do this, not now. We have evidence, new evidence. The word evidence is a bomb that only goes off after you've set it on the table. And everyone has had time to make a choice. They let him into the observation room because the manual said you never let the federal government stand in a hallway, and because the warden wanted the man, this noisy interruption, to confront the machinery he was interrupting." Ruiz fumbled with the folder. Photographs slid across the table, their edges catching on the roughness. The warden glanced. Grainy stills. A parking garage. A man not Raphael stepping into the frame. His face a profile the camera loved more than any prosecutor should. Another angle from a traffic camera the defense had never known existed. A timestamp that didn't fit the state's staircase. Chain of custody? The warden barked out of habit. Ruiz slammed down a signed affidavit with names the warden recognized and one he did not. Miguel Valencia. The murdered man's brother. He came forward, Ruiz said, words tumbling, because of this. He held up a phone, thumb trembling to show a video filmed badly on a couch in a light that hoped to be mercy. In the video, Miguel, red-eyed like shame, said, "It wasn't him. I knew because the man who ordered it told me. I was supposed to keep quiet." "They couldn't, not after." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The warden looked at the clock. 11:57 p.m. The switch was still a switch. The time was still a director. But some script had buckled. He pressed the intercom. "Hold." The nurses looked up, half gratitude, half fear of what comes after deviation. Raphael lay still, eyes open to a ceiling that might have been sky if someone had made a different decision 60 years ago. He didn't crane to see the commotion. He didn't smile. He had the look of a man who knows the bullet may have been diverted, but the war is out there, waiting for him like weather. Why now? The warden demanded of Ruiz. He meant it like an accusation, because the alternative was to mean it like a prayer. Ruiz's face said he had run through too many doors already today. 2 hours ago, he said, swallowing, a woman in blue knocked on Valencia's door. He says she looked like their mother when she'd been up all night worrying. She told him, the truth takes longer than a life, but it gets where it's going. Tonight you will see it walk. He called me crying. I told him he was drunk. Then he sent the video and the drive. I drove. He didn't apologize for believing too late. He didn't have time. The warden thought of the words, keep it, and felt the paper in Ruiz's folder heat like a coal that had learned patience. He stared at the icon on the table because it was easier than staring at the air where a woman had stood. He exhaled through his teeth, a sound men make when they accept that a new rule has entered the room. Then he did what the manual doesn't imagine a warden doing. He picked up a phone and called the governor's emergency line. He did not leave a message. He waited, and when the sleepy voice said, "What is it?" he spoke with the clarity of a man ordering a meal he has never tasted, but knows will keep him alive. He said, "We have exculpatory evidence presented by the U.S. Attorney's Office in the case of Rafael Ortiz. I am halting the execution pending review." He did not ask for permission. He announced a fact. The line went quiet. Somewhere far away, in a big house with rugs the color of old money, a political calculus drew itself like a snake, swallowing logic. The governor exhaled. "On your head," he said, which is what leaders say when they hope heads will roll in a direction that benefits them. "On my head," the warden agreed and hung up. He was not a religious man. He was a builder of rooms where other men talked about God. But he felt then a pressure like a hand not pushing down but holding steady. He pressed the intercom again, and his voice did not shake. "Stand down," he told the chamber. Machines were quieted, lines were unhooked with the kind of tenderness that makes you understand how much violence is usually done by people pretending not to be violent. The door to the chamber opened, and the air changed back to ordinary. Raphael sat up slowly, as if the air might be a trick. He looked at Father Luis, who looked back with a face that had run out of professional expressions and was down to the raw ones. "She came," Raphael said, not to boast. "To record." Father Luis nodded. "She came." The guard wiped his face with the heel of his palm and made a sound like a laugh breaking its leg. The warden stepped into the chamber and did something he had never done in 28 years of supervision. He apologized to a man in chains. "If the review finds what it looks like," he said, "you'll walk." He didn't promise. He didn't need to. The promise was happening with or without him. News broke, because news is a dog that cannot not bark. The widow saw the crawl at the bottom of a sports channel and sat very still. She did not hate the idea of mercy. She hated the idea that her grief had been hung on the wrong nail. Miguel Valencia vanished into protective custody with a fear that knew his family better than any badge could. The witness, who had sworn she saw Raphael fleeing, walked into a precinct with remorse like a fever, and told a detective the thing she'd never told her priest. She had been paid to see what she said she saw. A name leaked, then a second name, then a title for a man who didn't like his name on things. By dawn, old enemies were calling old friends to ask if forgiveness could come with conditions. The city became a rumor it told on itself. In the prison yard, a wind arrived that belonged to another county. Birds no one could name landed on the razor wire and didn't cut themselves. Men who had decided long ago not to be moved stood still and listened to the way a place sounds when the pressure drops. Raphael was taken back to B-17 because there is no special room in a prison for miracles. The door closed. He sat. He did not sleep. He counted the names he had practiced forgiving and wondered how forgiveness changes when the world admits it aimed poorly. He thought about the woman in blue and the sentence she'd handed him like a tool. "Tonight, you will see it walk." He did not know if she meant truth or him. 2 days later, a judge who had made a career of polite detachment read Ruiz's motion, and felt something crack in a place he had mistaken for bone. He signed an order with a pen that had signed 1,000 safe things. The order said what everyone had been saying sotto voce while pretending not to: release pending retrial. When the warden read the order, he walked out into the yard and stood under the sky like a man who had found a second front door to his own house. He called the control room. "Open B-17, he said. He paused, then added, as if making a point to the air, "Please." The door opened. The guard stepped aside. Raphael did not move. "It's real," the guard said. And in those 2 words was a career's worth of unlearning. They gave him back his clothes and a plastic bag with the life the state had told him to stop needing. He walked not like a man leaving a cage, but like a man stepping into a memory. Outside, a small crowd had formed, because humans cannot resist a threshold. Father Luis waited near the gate, in a jacket that made him look less like a priest and more like someone's uncle who would always show up. Ruiz stood too, hair combed with his fingers, tie unknotting as if it wanted to breathe. The warden kept to the side, because he understood the difference between center and support. The sun, oblivious to symbolism, did what it always did at that hour. Raphael stopped just on the prison's shadow line, as if to ask the day to introduce itself. He didn't step forward. He turned, back toward the grey, back toward the tower, where a woman in blue had found a way to speak a sentence into a room that ate sentences for breakfast. The reporters, starved for a clean story, shouted questions designed to render him into a headline. Raphael raised a hand, not to silence them, but to propose a different ending. He looked at the warden. "You kept it," he said. The warden nodded. He had in fact kept everything. The video, the affidavit, the photographs, the manual that didn't mention any of this. "Good," Raphael said. He looked up at the tower. "Because I have to go back in." The crowd inhaled. Ruiz swore softly enough to pass for prayer. Father Luis felt the tug of the old stories where prophets ruin parties by telling the truth in season. "Why?" he asked, not trying to make it sound wise. Raphael pointed toward the wing no camera liked. "Because the man who did this is in there. Not the man who swung, the man who told him where to stand. I remember his eyes. I remember the smell of his cologne. I remember the way he said my name when he told me I'd be fine. He's in protective custody on a tax case, waiting out a storm he thinks has passed." He smiled, but it wasn't kind. "She told me truth walks. I think it's about to run. The warden could have said no. He didn't." He gestured to the side gate, reserved for staff who don't want to be seen. 2 minutes, he said, knowing it would be longer. They walked together, warden and almost freed man, into a corridor that had memorized their steps. The guards didn't stop them because the warden's face had the look of a man in the one act of his life that will matter. They reached a door with a rectangle of glass, the color of secrets. The warden nodded to the officer. The door opened. Inside sat a man whose haircut had been expensive in another life. His hands were folded like a man who admits neither guilt nor innocence, only inconvenience. He looked up. "So Raphael," his mouth tilted, surprised his cousin. "You," he said, tasting the word as if it were a fruit that might be poisonous or perfect. Raphael stepped in and closed the door with his heel. "No audience, no mics, no lawyers." "Do you know what she said?" Raphael asked. The man's eyes flickered, because even people who deal in pain fear grammar when it arrives wearing hope. "She said the truth takes longer than a life. That frightened you, didn't it?" "Because you've been living like time is a weapon you own." The man stood. His smile was a blade being tested against a thumbnail. "I don't know what play you think you're running," he said, "but if you take one more step into this room—" He didn't finish because Raphael did step, and the room got small, and there was nowhere for lies to sit. What happened next did not make the papers, because some miracles show off and others do logistics. The man with the haircut confessed, but not to Raphael. He confessed to the warden, because the warden said 3 words that rearranged the furniture. "I'll keep it." He meant the evidence. He meant the record. He meant the promise that this wouldn't be one more hallway whisper. The man spoke like a dam decommissioning itself, and as he did, something in the prison sighed. A sound you could miss if you had never listened to buildings breathe. When it was done, the warden called Ruiz. Ruiz called the judge. The judge called the governor. The governor called a pollster, and then his conscience, and then said, on the record, the state had been wrong. That night, nobody saw the woman in blue, but everybody saw what she'd done. Raphael walked out under a sky that had found a new way to be blue. Reporters tried to drape him in narrative. He ducked and let it fall. Father Luis hugged him in that awkward man way that is actually the most honest. The warden shook his hand and then, surprising himself, pulled him in. I don't know how to live with this, the warden admitted into Raphael's shoulder. We're all about to learn, Raphael said. He didn't let go quickly. You think it ends there because that's where it would end if the world were a court opinion or a clip. But the next day, a god's mother called her son and said she had a dream that told her to look under the floorboard in the old visitors' hall. Under that board was a phone. On that phone were photographs of signatures on contracts for services rendered by men who didn't list morals on their resumes. The day after, a woman in a laundromat told Father Luis that a lady in blue had sat beside her, folded a towel that wasn't hers, and said, If you speak now, you won't choke on it later. The woman spoke. The city had to relearn its own map. Meanwhile, somewhere private and unphotographed, the widow of the murdered ADA watched the confession video twice and then drove to a church where she had not been in 10 years. She lit a candle she did not call a cliché. She cried for the man she'd lost and the part of her that had been fed certainty like candy. She did not ask for an apparition. She asked for a place to put her hands. 3 weeks after the night, the room fell silent. There was a small gathering with no podium. Raphael stood beside a mural that kids in the neighborhood had painted over years of birthdays and funerals. It was sloppy and perfect. He spoke not as a saint and not as a defendant, finally allowed a word. He spoke like a person who had bargained with the dark and found the light does not make refunds. I begged for a vision, he said. What I got was a job. He didn't elaborate. Nobody needed him to. In a city learning that truth doesn't travel by limousine, the Virgin Mary had kept her appointment, and what she left behind was not a clean story, but a trail you could walk if you weren't in a hurry. At midnight, when the air goes honest, the observation room in the prison sat empty. The icon was gone, returned to hands that knew how to hold it. The crack in the wall had not grown. The lights hummed the way lights do when they have nothing to prove. If you stood just inside the door and closed your eyes, you could still feel the shape of the silence that had silenced everyone. You might think that was the miracle. It wasn't. The miracle was that the next time someone asked for the impossible, the warden didn't underline within reason. He wrote, in a hand that had learned humility the hard way, make room. And somewhere, on a street that smelled like rain and frying dough, a woman in blue walked by a window and smiled the dangerous smile of someone who knows how far the truth can go when it finally gets its shoes on.